They left him for dead in the desert. His engineering mind saved his life. When Marcus Chin's hiking partner shoved him off the cliff edge at dawn, he had exactly 3 seconds to understand he'd been carrying a fortune in his backpack, and someone wanted it badly enough to kill for it. Welcome to Heartfire Obsession. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, because this story of survival and ingenuity will show you what the human mind can do when death is just one mistake away. The betrayal nobody saw coming. The rocks came up fast, faster than thought, faster than the scream that died in Marcus's throat. He hit the slope hard, tumbling, his body a rag doll bouncing between boulders and scraggly desert brush. His shoulder cracked against stone. His ribs screamed. Then nothing but the sound of his own gasping and the distant echo of footsteps running away from the cliff edge above. Marcus Chun was a hydrologist, not an adventurer. At 32, he'd spent most of his life in university labs and water treatment facilities, studying aquifer maps and mineral content reports. He wore glasses that slipped down his nose when he got excited about sediment layers. He preferred spreadsheets to people. And he'd trusted David Reeves, his grad school friend, because David had always been the charming one, the one who smoothed over Marcus's awkwardness at conferences, the one who'd suggested this hiking trip through Nevada's backcountry to clear their heads after their joint research project. The research project. That's what this was about. Marcus lay on his back, staring up at the pale pre-dawn sky, every breath a knife between his ribs. His backpack had cushioned some of the fall, but now it sat wedged beneath him at an odd angle. Inside it were his notes, his portable testing kit, and the 3 vials of water samples he'd collected from an underground spring they'd discovered 2 days ago. Water that shouldn't exist. Water that, according to every geological survey, every satellite image, every expert opinion, could not possibly be there. But it was. And Marcus had tested it. The mineral composition was unlike anything in the American Southwest, dense with rare earth elements, lithium, and compounds that could revolutionize battery technology. The spring wasn't just water. It was liquid gold, worth potentially hundreds of millions. David knew. Of course David knew. They'd celebrated together when Marcus ran the first tests. They'd talked about publishing together, about the grants, the recognition. But somewhere between that celebration and this morning, David had done the math differently. One researcher meant one share. One dead researcher meant everything. Counting the damage. Marcus forced himself to move, to catalog his body. Left arm useless, probably dislocated shoulder. 3, maybe 4 cracked ribs. His glasses were gone, turned everything beyond 10 feet into an impressionist painting. Blood trickled from a gash above his eyebrow. His right ankle throbbed, but held weight when he tested it carefully. He'd fallen maybe 60 feet down a steep ravine into a narrow canyon he couldn't remember from the maps. The walls rose on either side, rust-red stone baking even in the early morning. Above, the cliff edge where David had pushed him was invisible. No way to climb back up, not with one arm. Marcus pulled his backpack free and inventoried its contents with shaking hands. The water vials, miraculously intact. His satellite phone, shattered, screen spiderwebbed, and dark. His paper maps, torn. His water bottles, one crushed, one half full, maybe 20 ounces. His emergency kit, a joke. Some bandages, energy bars, a small first aid kit designed for blisters and headaches, not attempted murder. The morning sun was already climbing, and Marcus knew the desert. Knew it academically, from research papers and temperature charts. Out here, summer temperatures could hit 115 degrees by afternoon. Without water, without shelter, he had maybe 2 days. With his injuries, maybe less. But Marcus Chin hadn't spent 15 years studying water systems to die of thirst in the desert. The hydrologist's advantage. Most people thought water was simple. You either had it or you didn't. But Marcus knew water the way a musician knows melody. He understood its behavior, its hiding places, its tells. And right now, squinting through his damaged vision at the canyon walls, he saw something nobody else would have noticed. There, a dark stain on the rock face about 30 feet down the canyon. A vertical streak of discoloration where minerals had leached out over time. That meant seepage, water moving through the stone, probably from the same aquifer that fed the spring he'd discovered. Not enough to pool, but enough to create moisture. And where there was moisture in the desert, there were possibilities. Marcus stood, his vision swimming, his ribs grinding. He wrapped his injured arm against his chest with his belt, the pain enough to make him vomit, but he held it down. Dehydration was already his enemy. He couldn't afford to lose more fluid. He started walking down the canyon, following the seepage stain. The sun climbed higher. His shadow shortened. The temperature rose from warm to hot to blistering. Sweat evaporated before it could even bead on his skin, and he knew that was bad, knew his body was losing water faster than he could track. The canyon twisted, narrowed, opened into a wider area where centuries of flash floods had carved smooth channels in the bedrock. And there, in the deepest channel, Marcus found what he was looking for. Damp sand. The impossible choice. Not wet, not enough to scoop and drink, but damp, retaining moisture from the aquifer somewhere below. Marcus dropped to his knees, his vision tunneling, and started digging with his one good hand. The sand was cool inches down, definitely moist. But it would take hours to collect enough water this way, hours he might not have. Then he saw the cairn. Someone had been here before. A neat stack of stones, the traditional trail marker, sitting at the canyon's edge. But this one had something extra, a small piece of fabric tied to the top stone, sun-bleached but still intact, pointing down a side channel Marcus had almost missed. He followed it, stumbling now, his water bottle empty, his mouth tasting of copper and dust. The side channel was barely 3 feet wide, the walls closing in, and for a terrifying moment Marcus thought he'd trapped himself. But then the passage opened up, and he stopped breathing. It was a tanaja, a natural rock basin carved by centuries of water flow. And it held water. Maybe 50 gallons of cloudy, algae-green water sitting in the shade of an overhang, protected from the sun. Marcus had found dozens of these in his research, had written papers about their ecology, their importance to desert survival. He knew exactly what this water contained. Bacteria, parasites, mineral concentrations that could cause severe illness. Drinking it untreated was like playing Russian roulette with your intestines. He had no way to purify it. No filter, no purification tablets, no way to boil it. The sun was directly overhead now, the temperature climbing past 110. His tongue was thick in his mouth. His hands trembled. Behind him, somewhere in the canyon system, he thought he heard voices. David, maybe, coming back to make sure the job was finished. Or worse, coming for the water samples Marcus still carried. Marcus looked at the green water, looked at his useless satellite phone, looked at the canyon walls that trapped him like a maze. And then he remembered something from his research, something about natural filtration, about sand and charcoal, and the way water moved through sediment layers. He had his testing kit. He had his knowledge. And he had the one thing David had never possessed, the ability to see water not as a commodity, but as a system that could be understood, manipulated, engineered. Marcus Chen pulled out his testing kit and started working, even as his body screamed for him to just drink, just survive, just give in. Because he knew something David didn't. The difference between surviving and dying in the desert wasn't about strength or courage. It was about understanding that water keeps secrets. And Marcus had spent his entire life learning how to make it tell the truth. Marcus's hands shook so badly that he dropped the first testing vial twice before managing to collect a sample from the tanaja. The water was worse than he'd thought. Turbidity off the charts, biological contamination visible even to his damaged eyesight as greenish swirls of algae. His portable spectrometer confirmed what his gut already knew. Drinking this straight would trigger violent dysentery within hours, leaving him even more dehydrated and helpless than he already was. But Marcus wasn't thinking about drinking it straight. He was thinking about filtration layers, about how ancient aquifers cleaned themselves through miles of sandstone, about how his grandmother had shown him, when he was 8 years old, how to make muddy creek water clear using nothing but sand, gravel, and patience. The sun was a physical weight now, pressing down on his shoulders like a predator's paw. His broken ribs sent lightning bolts of pain through his chest with each breath. But his mind was racing, calculating, building a system in his head before his hands ever touched stone, building the impossible filter. The first thing Marcus needed was charcoal. Activated carbon was nature's best water purifier, capable of removing organic compounds, bacteria, and even some parasites. He couldn't make activated charcoal, not without controlled heat and specialized equipment. But he could make regular charcoal, and even regular charcoal would help. He gathered dead brush from the canyon floor, the desiccated remains of desert plants that had given up years ago. Using a flat rock and a curved depression in the stone, he built a small fire, coaxing it to life with hand sanitizer from his first aid kit as an accelerant. The flames hurt to look at in the bright sunlight, but Marcus watched carefully, feeding the fire until the branches had burned down to pure carbon. While the charcoal cooled, he worked on the rest of his filtration system. Using his damaged backpack as a container, he created layers. At the bottom, he placed a piece of cloth torn from his shirt, the finest mesh he could create. Above that, he crushed the cooled charcoal into powder between two rocks, creating a thick layer of carbon about 3 inches deep. Above the charcoal, he added sand from the canyon floor, first fine sand, then coarser particles, then small pebbles, then larger stones. Each layer would catch different sizes of contaminants. Each would slow the water down, giving the charcoal time to absorb bacteria and organic compounds. It was a primitive version of the multi-stage filtration systems Marcus had designed in his lab. But primitive didn't mean ineffective. The problem was time. Water filtered through this system would drip slowly, maybe a cup per hour. And Marcus was already fading. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His urine had been dark orange the last time he'd managed to produce any. The headache behind his eyes felt like something trying to split his skull from the inside. The hidden observer. As Marcus positioned his makeshift filter above a collection container, a hollowed-out section of cactus he'd carved with his pocket knife, he heard it again. Footsteps, distant but distinct, and voices. Tracks went down here. No way he survived that fall. David's voice. But there was someone else with him. A woman's voice, responding too quietly for Marcus to catch the words. Marcus froze, his pulse hammering. David had brought help, or hired help, someone else to make sure there were no loose ends. The water samples were still in his pack, still intact. That's what they wanted. The evidence of the discovery, the proof that could be patented, published, claimed. But David didn't know Marcus was alive. And that was an advantage. Marcus looked at his filter system, at the tanaja of contaminated water, at the narrow side canyon that had hidden this place from casual view. He had maybe 5 minutes before they reached his location. Maybe less. The calculated risk. This is where most people would panic, would make the choice between hiding and running. But Marcus Chun was a systems thinker. He didn't react. He calculated variables. Variable 1. He couldn't run. Not with his injuries, not without water, not in his condition. Variable 2. He couldn't fight. 1 good arm against 2 healthy people meant certain death. Variable 3. He had something they didn't. Knowledge. And the water samples they wanted. Marcus made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone else. Instead of hiding, instead of preparing to defend himself, he poured contaminated water through his filter system. Watched it drip slowly, agonizingly slowly, into the collection container. The first drops came through murky brown, then lighter, then almost clear. He tested the output with his portable kit. The bacterial count had dropped by over 90%. The turbidity was nearly 0. It wasn't perfect. There were still trace contaminants, still risks, but it was drinkable. Barely, but drinkable. Marcus filled his water bottle halfway with filtered water, lifted it to his cracked lips, and stopped. The footsteps were closer now, echoing off the canyon walls. Marcus looked at the water, looked at his testing kit, and then he smiled, despite the pain, despite the fear, despite everything. Because he'd just realized how to survive this. And it wasn't by drinking the water. It was by understanding that David had made one critical mistake. David thought the water samples were valuable because of what they contained. But Marcus knew they were valuable because of what they proved, that he understood water systems better than anyone else alive. And that knowledge, that ability to find water, purify water, engineer water solutions in impossible conditions, was worth more than any spring or sample. David wanted the samples. Fine. Marcus would give him the samples. But not before making sure David understood exactly who held the real power here. The confrontation nobody expected. Marcus carefully poured the filtered water back into the tanaja, clouding it again. He disassembled his filtration system, scattering the components. He took his 3 precious water vials, and, moving with the kind of deliberate calm that only comes from absolute certainty, He emptied 2 of them into the contaminated tanaja. The liquid gold, the rare earth elements, the fortune worth millions, he poured it away like it was nothing. Then he took the 3rd vial, the last sample, and tucked it carefully into his sock, pressed against his injured ankle where the swelling would hide it. When David and his companion, a hard-faced woman Marcus didn't recognize, wearing tactical gear and carrying a professional climbing pack, finally appeared at the mouth of the side canyon, they found Marcus sitting beside the tanaja, his back against the rock, looking half dead. Which wasn't far from the truth. But Marcus had stopped trembling. His mind was clear now, sharp with dehydration and pain and purpose. "Jesus," David said, his face going pale. "Marcus, you're alive. I thought. When you fell. When you pushed me," Marcus corrected, his voice rasping but steady. "Let's not pretend anymore, David." The woman's hand moved toward her belt. Marcus saw something there, probably a weapon. But David held up a hand, stopping her. His face shifted, the mask of concern dropping away to reveal something colder underneath. "Where are the samples, Marcus?" Marcus gestured weakly at the tanaja. "Contaminated. Dropped my pack in the fall. Everything shattered, mixed with that algae soup. Your fortune is floating in 50 gallons of undrinkable water." David stared at him, then at the tanaja, then back at Marcus. And Marcus saw it, the moment of doubt. The question, was Marcus lying? "I don't believe you," David said. But his voice wavered. Marcus laughed, and it hurt. God, it hurt. But he laughed anyway. "You think I protect them? After what you did? Take a sample, David. Test it yourself. It's all mixed now. You'll find traces of the compounds, sure, but nothing pure. Nothing patentable. You killed me for a tanaja full of poison water." The woman stepped forward. "He's lying. Search him." "Go ahead," Marcus said. "But know this. I've been out here for 8 hours without water. In this heat. With these injuries. You think I'm coherent enough to play games? I'm barely conscious." Which was true. Marcus could feel himself fading, the adrenaline that had kept him sharp starting to fail. His vision was darkening at the edges. David knelt beside the tanaja, pulled out his own testing kit, of course he'd brought one, and collected a sample. Marcus watched him work, watched the readings come back showing trace elements, but nothing concentrated, nothing useful. Exactly what you'd expect from valuable samples mixed with 50 gallons of contaminated water. "Damn it." David slammed his fist against the rock. "All of it. Everything we worked for. Everything I worked for," Marcus whispered. "You just wanted to steal it." The woman looked at David. "So what do we do with him?" And that was the moment Marcus had been waiting for. The moment when David had to make a choice. Leave Marcus here to die slowly from dehydration and exposure, or finish the job quickly. Either way, David was committed to murder now. Either way, he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. But Marcus had one more card to play. "There's a second spring," he said quietly. Both of them froze. "What?" David's voice was sharp. Marcus closed his eyes, let his head fall back against the stone. "You think I'd put all my discoveries in one location? There's a second spring. Northeast quadrant. Bigger flow rate. Higher concentration of rare elements. I left it off the maps, kept the coordinates in my head. Insurance." He could feel them staring at him. Could feel David's mind racing, calculating. Was Marcus lying? Or was this real? "Tell me," David said, his voice tight with desperation. Marcus smiled, eyes still closed. "Get me to a hospital. Get me real medical care. And maybe I'll remember the coordinates. Or leave me here and die knowing that somewhere out there is a fortune you'll never find. Your choice, David. But decide fast. I don't have much time, and neither do you. The moment I die, that location dies with me." The silence stretched out. Marcus could hear the woman shifting her weight, could hear David's breathing, could hear the desert wind whistling through the canyon like the world's oldest music. "We take him," David finally said. "We get him stable enough to talk. Then we get the coordinates." "And after?" the woman asked. "After, accidents happen in the desert all the time." Marcus felt hands lift him, felt himself being carried. His plan was working, but barely. He was buying time, nothing more. Time to survive, time to think, time to find a way to turn the tables completely. Because Marcus Chin knew something David still didn't understand. The real power wasn't in the water. It was in knowing how to find water. And as long as Marcus was alive, he was the only map that mattered. They carried Marcus for 3 hours before reaching David's base camp. A professional setup with a satellite internet connection, a first aid station that belonged in an expedition, and enough equipment to make it clear this had never been a casual hiking trip. This had been a planned extraction. They'd been ready to take the samples and disappear. The woman, whose name Marcus learned was Claire, turned out to be a former army medic. She reset his shoulder with brutal efficiency that made him scream into a leather strap, splinted his ribs, cleaned and bandaged his wounds, and hooked him to an 4-bag. Not out of compassion, out of necessity. A dead man couldn't give coordinates. 2 bags of saline, Claire told David. Then he'll be coherent enough to talk. But we need to do this soon. That fall did internal damage I can't fix out here. He's bleeding somewhere inside. Marcus listened through the haze of pain and medication, cataloging every word. They thought he was barely conscious. They thought the 4 and the pain meds would make him compliant, grateful even. They had no idea that Marcus's mind was still running calculations, still building systems, still planning. David pulled a camp chair close to the cot where Marcus lay. The sun was setting now, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust. Beautiful, if you weren't dying. Okay, Marcus, David said, his voice almost gentle. You've earned a stay of execution. Now give me the coordinates of the second spring. Marcus let his eyes focus slowly on David's face, as if fighting through fog. His tongue felt thick, but that was real. The dehydration hadn't been fixed yet, not completely. Northeast quadrant, Marcus murmured. 7 miles from the first spring. Elevation 6,000 feet. There's a formation. 3 rocks stacked naturally. Looks like a hand pointing west. The spring is 40 feet east of that marker. David pulled out a map, spreading it across his knees. Show me. Marcus made a weak gesture toward the map, his hand trembling. David moved closer, leaning in. Marcus pointed with one shaky finger at a section of the map. There, he whispered. That's where. And then Marcus's eyes rolled back, and he went limp, his hand falling away from the map. Marcus! David shook him. Marcus, wake up. Claire checked his pulse, his pupils. He's out. Body shutting down. I told you we needed to move faster. David swore, slamming his fist against the chair. Is he dying? Maybe. Probably. I don't know. I'm a field medic, not a trauma surgeon. If there's internal bleeding like I think, he's got hours at best. Marcus listened to all of this from inside his conscious mind, keeping his breathing slow and steady, his body completely relaxed. He'd learned this technique years ago during meditation classes he'd taken for stress management. The ability to appear unconscious while remaining fully aware. He'd never imagined he'd use it to survive attempted murder. We have to go now, David said. Before he dies, and we lose the location completely. It's almost dark, Claire objected. Night navigation in this terrain. We have GPS. We have lights. And we have one shot at this before our window closes. The moment Marcus dies, any chance of finding that second spring dies with him. We go now. Marcus heard them gathering supplies, heard the rustle of packs being loaded. They were leaving him alone at the camp. They thought he was dying anyway, thought the 4 would keep him alive for a few more hours if they were lucky. They had no idea they'd just made their final mistake. The water thief's real gambit. The moment their footsteps faded into the desert darkness, Marcus opened his eyes. His body was a symphony of pain, but his mind was sharp now, focused by the saline and by purpose. He pulled the 4 line from his arm, wrapped the insertion point with gauze, and slowly, carefully, sat up. Everything hurt. Everything. But Marcus had bought himself exactly what he needed, time and resources. He inventoried the camp with the methodical care of someone who'd spent his life analyzing systems. David had left behind most of his equipment, too heavy to haul into the backcountry on a midnight search mission. The satellite internet connection was still active. The laptop they'd been using was password protected, but Marcus had watched David type it in earlier, his birthday, because some people never learned basic security. Marcus logged in and sent 3 emails in rapid succession. The first went to his department head at the university, with GPS coordinates of the camp, a detailed description of events, and copies of his research files including the original water analysis from the real spring. He attached photos of his injuries taken with the laptop's camera. Subject line, attempted murder in progress. Send authorities immediately. The second went to the Nevada State Police with the same information. The third went to his lawyer with instructions to file claims on all water rights associated with both spring locations in Marcus's name alone, and to immediately revoke David Reeves from any shared research agreements. Then Marcus opened David's research files on the laptop and started reading. What he found made his blood run cold despite the desert heat still radiating from the rocks. David had already set up a shell corporation, had already drafted patents with himself as sole inventor, had already negotiated preliminary contracts with mining companies worth $40 million. This wasn't opportunistic greed. This was premeditated theft on a massive scale. David had been planning this for months, maybe longer. The hiking trip, the accident, all of it carefully orchestrated. But David had underestimated one thing. He'd thought Marcus was just a smart guy who'd gotten lucky. He'd never understood that Marcus didn't just find water. Marcus understood systems. Human systems, legal systems, geological systems. And right now, Marcus was building the most important system of his life. The spring that never was. Marcus checked his watch. They'd been gone 45 minutes. At 7 miles in rough terrain, even with GPS and lights, they'd need at least 2 hours to reach the coordinates Marcus had given them. 2 hours there, however long to search, 2 hours back. He had maybe 5 hours, probably more. David would search carefully, thoroughly, not wanting to miss anything. Because the spring Marcus had directed them to didn't exist. The coordinates were real. Marcus had actually pointed to a real location on the map. But there was no spring there. Marcus had checked every geological survey, every satellite image, every water resource map of the region. That location was solid bedrock, no aquifer, no seepage, no water. They'd spend hours searching an empty site, growing more desperate, more angry, until they'd have to accept the truth. Marcus had lied, and by the time they came back, Marcus would be gone. But first, he had one more system to build. The engineer's final solution. Using supplies from the camp, Marcus constructed something beautiful in its simplicity. He took David's expensive water filtration pump, ironic, really, and connected it to a collection basin. Then he dug down 3 feet at the location where he'd seen moisture indicators in the soil, the subtle signs of subsurface water that most people would miss. Using techniques he perfected in his research, he created a solar still combined with a subsurface water collector. By morning, it would produce almost a gallon of clean water per day. Enough for one person to survive indefinitely. Enough for Marcus to wait for rescue while David and Claire wandered lost in the desert, their water supplies dwindling, searching for a spring that existed only in Marcus's carefully constructed lie. But Marcus wasn't cruel. He left a note, weighted down with rocks where they'd see it when they returned. David, the second spring doesn't exist. I lied to buy time. Authorities have been contacted. By the time you read this, police are on their way. You have 2 choices. Come back to camp and face justice, or run into the desert and die of thirst searching for something that was never there. Choose wisely. And understand this. I didn't beat you with strength or luck. I beat you by understanding what you never could. Water doesn't keep secrets. But people do. And the biggest secret was that you never really knew me at all. Marcus. He left the solar still running. Left the camp clearly marked with bright fabric so rescue helicopters could spot it from the air. And then Marcus Chun, hydrologist and water engineer, did something that would have seemed impossible 8 hours earlier. He walked. Not far, maybe half a mile to a better vantage point where he could see anyone approaching. Where he could rest his broken body against a smooth rock face and watch the sunrise, knowing that he'd survived not because he was strong or brave or lucky, but because he'd understood something fundamental. Systems can be engineered. Problems can be solved. And the most dangerous weapon in the desert isn't a gun or a knife. It's knowledge. The aftermath of ingenuity. The helicopter arrived 4 hours after dawn, following the GPS coordinates from Marcus's email. The police were with them. They found Marcus conscious, weak but stable, and they found his solar still producing clean water. They also found David and Claire 3 miles from the camp, dehydrated and defeated, having spent the entire night searching for a spring that didn't exist. David tried to explain, tried to claim Marcus had fallen, that it was an accident, that he was trying to help. But the evidence was overwhelming. Marcus's emails, time-stamped and detailed. The Shell Corporation. The contracts. Claire's testimony once she understood she was facing accessory to attempted murder charges. It all fell apart for David in less than an hour. In the hospital, 3 days later, Marcus watched the news coverage of his story. They were calling him the desert engineer, the hydrologist who'd survived attempted murder using nothing but scientific knowledge and ingenuity. His department head visited with papers making Marcus the sole patent holder for the rare earth spring discovery. The contracts David had negotiated were transferred to Marcus's name. $40 million, with more potentially coming. But what Marcus kept thinking about, as he lay in his hospital bed with his shoulder immobilized and his ribs wrapped tight, was that moment in the canyon when he'd first seen the contaminated water in the Tanaja. The moment when most people would have given up or made a desperate, fatal mistake. He'd survived because he'd never stopped thinking like an engineer. Never stopped seeing problems as systems to be solved. Never stopped trusting that knowledge, real knowledge about how the world works, was more powerful than strength or weapons or desperation. A week later, when Marcus was released from the hospital, he drove back to the desert. Not to the camp, not to the scene of David's betrayal, but to the real spring, the one he'd actually discovered, the one David had been willing to kill for. Marcus stood at its edge, watching clear water bubble up from deep in the earth, carrying its fortune of rare elements. He thought about how water moves through stone, how it finds paths invisible to the eye, how it sustains life in the harshest environments on Earth. And he thought about how he'd done the same thing. Found a path, sustained life, survived. Marcus Chin filled a single vial with spring water and sealed it carefully. Not for patent claims or profit, for himself. A reminder that when the world tries to bury you, when someone pushes you off a cliff and leaves you for dead, you have two choices. You can give up, or you can remember that every problem is just a system waiting to be understood. Every disaster is just a challenge waiting for someone smart enough to solve it. Marcus chose understanding. Marcus chose engineering. Marcus chose survival. And in the end, that made all the difference. The desert wind whispered across the spring's surface, creating tiny ripples that caught the sunlight like diamonds. Marcus smiled, pocketed his vial, and walked back to his truck. He had work to do, a company to build, a fortune to invest in water sustainability research, a life to live, because he'd learned something David never understood. The real treasure wasn't the water. It was knowing how to find it. And that knowledge, that ingenuity, that intelligence everyone had underestimated in the quiet, glasses-wearing lab researcher, that was infinite, renewable, eternal as the desert itself. Marcus Chun drove away from the spring, leaving it flowing behind him, knowing he'd be back. Not as a victim, not as someone who'd barely survived, but as the man who'd turned near death into triumph using nothing but his mind.